I'm Professor Richard Wolff, and what we're witnessing today in the ongoing legal and political spectacle surrounding former President Donald Trump is nothing short of a masterclass in institutional unraveling. The very people who sought to corner Trump in the name of justice are now finding themselves cornered by the very system they weaponized. The prosecutor, once held up as a symbol of accountability and moral superiority, is suddenly the one under fire. And let me tell you, this isn't just about one courtroom or one case. This is about a system eating itself alive. Now, let's begin with what actually happened. In a stunning turn, the judge overseeing this high-profile Trump case openly challenged the conduct and credibility of the lead prosecutor. This was not a subtle exchange. It was a judicial dressing down, a kind of smoking out that left the prosecutor scrambling to explain inconsistencies and procedural overreach. You could feel the tension in that courtroom. The judge's words were clinical but sharp, exposing contradictions that most of the media conveniently ignored. It was, in every sense, the moment the prosecutor was thrown under the bus, and not by her enemies, but by the very system she thought was hers to control. It was one of those rare moments in American legal theater when the mask slips, when power itself stumbles over its own arrogance. Inside that courtroom, what was supposed to be another routine proceeding in the ongoing pursuit of Donald Trump turned into a public reckoning, not for the defendant, but for the prosecutor. The judge, calm yet commanding, did something almost no one expected. He questioned her, not the way judges casually probe a procedural point, but in a manner that cut straight through the political armor she had wrapped herself in. It was a reality check, a reminder that even in a system soaked with politics, the courtroom is not a campaign stage. And in that moment, the nation saw the balance of control begin to shift. The tension was palpable. Cameras outside couldn't capture it, but those in the room could feel it. The silence between each of the judge's sentences felt like a hammer striking the marble of institutional credibility. The prosecutor, once confident and self-assured, found herself scrambling for explanations, her voice faltering under the weight of her own contradictions. The judge's tone was not overtly hostile, it was surgical, disciplined, and devastatingly effective. It was the tone of a man tired of being used as a prop in someone else's political theater. That is where the power dynamic changed. The audience, both in the courtroom and across the nation, realized that the prosecution's narrative might not be as airtight, as righteous, or as purely justice-driven as they had been led to believe. Now here's where the story becomes more than just legal drama. It becomes a mirror held up to the entire American system. This wasn't just about evidence or law. It was about credibility, about integrity, about the trust we place in those who claim to represent justice. The judge's questions exposed something far more corrosive than procedural error. They revealed intent, the kind of intent that transforms a courtroom into a political battlefield. He pressed on why certain evidence had been delayed, why procedures were bent, and why the prosecution's arguments seemed more like headlines than law. Each question peeled back another layer of institutional facade, revealing a truth too many already suspected, that this wasn't justice being served, this was politics being performed. And the timing couldn't be more ironic. After years of being told that Trump was the one manipulating institutions for personal gain, the optics had reversed entirely. Here stood a prosecutor representing the very machinery of accountability, now appearing defensive, cornered, exposed. It was a moment that even Trump's fiercest critics couldn't easily explain away. The irony, the poetic symmetry of it all, was striking. The hunter was now the hunted, not in a literal sense, but in the moral, institutional one. When the very mechanism of justice begins questioning its own operators, you know something fundamental has shifted. But what makes this moment historic isn't just the embarrassment of one prosecutor, it's the symbolism of a judge saying, enough, enough with the theatrics. Enough with using the courtroom as a tool for narrative control. Enough with turning the justice system into a political weapon. It's the same frustration millions of Americans feel every time they watch powerful figures bend systems meant to protect the weak. The judge, intentionally or not, gave voice to that exhaustion, and that is what made it electric. His words didn't just challenge the prosecutor, they challenged the legitimacy of every institution that had silently allowed this distortion of justice to continue. In that sense, this was not merely a legal exchange, it was a rupture in the illusion. The prosecutor's unease wasn't just about losing a case, it was about losing control of the story. For too long, the establishment operated on the assumption that it could dictate both the narrative and the moral framework. But the moment that gavel hit the bench, that illusion began to crack. The judge forced the system to look in the mirror, and what it saw staring back wasn't noble or neutral. It was political, partisan, and power-driven. And that, right there, is the hook. The part that will echo long after the verdicts are read and the headlines fade. Because what we witnessed was not just accountability, it was exposure. The judge didn't merely correct a prosecutor, he reminded the entire nation that the rule of law, when properly upheld, is not loyal to power, it is loyal to truth. And in a time when truth itself has become negotiable, that reminder lands like thunder. When political machines begin to crack, they rarely do so quietly. What we're witnessing right now is not just a courtroom drama. It's an implosion from within the very establishment that once presented itself as invincible. For years, the machinery of American political power has operated like a finely tuned instrument projecting unity, control, and moral certainty. But the Trump prosecutions, and this latest embarrassment in particular, have exposed something the architects of that machine never intended for the public to see: disunity, desperation, and a ruthless instinct for self-preservation. When the prosecutor was thrown under the bus, it wasn't an accident. It was the system's reflex. A cold, calculated move to protect its own image at the expense of one of its own operatives. You could almost feel the machinery grinding and sparking as the pressure built. The establishment, which once moved as a single coordinated force, is now scrambling to contain the fallout. Behind closed doors, the conversations aren't about justice. They're about optics. Who gets blamed? Who takes the fall? Who can be sacrificed to maintain the illusion of legitimacy? This is how political institutions behave when they begin to fracture. The prosecutor's isolation is just the symptom. The disease runs deeper. When power structures start protecting themselves instead of their purpose, when loyalty becomes conditional on survival, it's no longer governance. It's panic dressed in professionalism. The moment the judge publicly questioned the prosecutor, you could sense the establishment recoil. Suddenly, this wasn't about Trump's alleged wrongdoing, it was about theirs. The prosecutor, who once had the full backing of political and media allies, was now treated like a liability. Those who once amplified her statements now distanced themselves with careful language and convenient amnesia. You could see the shift happen in real time, the tone of coverage, the guarded statements from party insiders, the silence from officials who had once cheered her on. That's how you know when a system is breaking down, when loyalty evaporates the moment exposure begins. There's something almost Shakespearean about it. The same political forces that elevated her, that encouraged the aggressive pursuit of Trump, are now pretending they barely knew her. It's the oldest trick in the book. The empire protects itself by sacrificing the expendable. But in doing so, it exposes its own hypocrisy, because if this prosecutor was truly acting on behalf of justice, why abandon her now? Why allow her credibility to collapse if she was executing the system's will? The answer is simple. She was never meant to be the story. She was a means to an end, a political instrument. And when instruments outlive their usefulness, the system discards them without hesitation. This unraveling tells us more about the establishment than any policy debate ever could. It reveals that their unity was never based on principle. It was based on convenience. They were united only as long as the narrative was under control. Once that control slipped, once a judge dared to challenge the script, the alliance began to fracture. Each player turned inward, calculating what must be said, who must be blamed, and how best to survive the fallout. The spectacle of it all is both tragic and revealing. Tragic because it shows how far institutions have drifted from genuine public service. Revealing because it unmasks the cynicism that drives modern political power. And here's the hook. This fracture within the establishment is not a bug. It's a feature of systems built on illusion. When you construct your authority on perception rather than truth, you become hostage to that perception. The moment reality intrudes, the moment a judge challenges the narrative or a witness fails to conform, the whole structure begins to shake. What's happening now is not the collapse of one case, but the slow erosion of an entire paradigm of control. The prosecutor's downfall is simply the first visible crack in a much larger foundation. You can already sense the unease spreading through the corridors of power. Officials, commentators, and political figures are suddenly cautious in their language, aware that any defense of her might implicate them. They're rewriting the story before the ink dries, hoping the public won't notice the shift. But people do notice. They can sense the hypocrisy. They see a system that rewards loyalty until it becomes inconvenient, then disposes of its loyal servants to save its own face. And that realization, more than any verdict or press conference, is what will haunt the establishment for years to come. Because once the public recognizes that the so-called guardians of justice are, in fact, guardians of self-interest, the illusion begins to die. And that death, slow, visible, undeniable, is what we are witnessing right now. The prosecutor was not thrown under the bus by mistake. She was sacrificed to keep the machine running a little longer. But in doing so, the machine exposed its own fragility. It showed us that beneath the polished surface of politics lies a structure held together not by conviction, but by fear. And when fear becomes the glue that binds an empire, it's only a matter of time before everything starts to come apart. For years, the warning signs have been flashing, yet few wanted to acknowledge them. The idea that the justice system, the very institution meant to stand above politics, could be weaponized for partisan gain seemed too cynical to accept. But now, as this case unravels, that once radical concern has become undeniable reality. What we are watching unfold is not merely a trial, it's the exposure of a system that has forgotten its purpose. When prosecutors begin to operate like political strategists and judges are forced to act as referees between ideology and law, justice ceases to be a sacred principle. It becomes a performance. And in this performance, truth is optional, but loyalty to the cause is mandatory. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of clarity, a setting where facts, not politics, determine outcomes. Yet the tone, the language, the very rhythm of this trial has felt more like a campaign rally than a legal proceeding. The prosecutor didn't approach the case as a guardian of justice, but as a soldier in a political war. Every statement seemed crafted for headlines, every accusation timed to generate outrage. The law became a stage prop, a convenient instrument to shape public opinion rather than seek objective truth. This isn't the justice system we were promised. This is political theater disguised as legal process. And when the curtain begins to fall, the actors don't look noble. They look exposed. Here lies the uncomfortable truth. This is not about one prosecutor or one case. This is about the slow corrosion of American justice under the acid of partisanship. The moment the law becomes a tool to punish ideological enemies, the social contract begins to crack. The brilliance of a free society is built on the belief that law stands apart from power, that every citizen, regardless of political affiliation, receives equal treatment. But what happens when that belief dies? When the courts start echoing the talking points of one political faction while silencing another? What happens when prosecutors act as political operatives rather than impartial arbiters? The answer is already playing out before our eyes. Trust evaporates, faith in the system collapses, and the line between governance and vendetta disappears. The judge's confrontation with the prosecutor was more than just a legal correction. It was an unmasking. His questions were surgical, revealing not just procedural flaws, but the deeper moral decay of a justice system turned political weapon. Why was this evidence delayed? Why were statements selectively leaked? Why did this case seem designed to serve a political purpose rather than a legal one? Each question wasn't just about law, it was about integrity. And as the prosecutor fumbled to answer, it became painfully clear that this case was never about pure justice. It was about power, who holds it, who fears losing it, and how far they're willing to go to keep it. The hook here is unmistakable. This is no longer about Trump alone. It's about precedent, because once justice is weaponized against one man, it can and will be weaponized against anyone. When the state learns it can use the law to silence, intimidate, or punish dissent, the citizens cease to be free. The prosecutor's aggressive pursuit, her use of selective enforcement, her reliance on spectacle over substance, all of it sets a dangerous standard. And the irony is suffocating. In trying to protect democracy through force, they have eroded the very democratic principles they claim to defend. There's a kind of tragic inevitability to this moment. The political class thought they could harness the justice system to achieve what they couldn't win at the ballot box. But institutions are not built to serve ideologies, they are built to serve fairness. Once you twist them for political convenience, you unleash forces that cannot easily be contained. We are seeing the aftermath of that arrogance now. The judge's rebuke wasn't merely a criticism. It was a warning. an alarm bell for a country drifting towards something darker than corruption. It's the warning that when politics infiltrates the courtroom, no one, not even those who thought they were on the right side, is safe from its reach. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of all this. The prosecutor's fall from grace is not a personal failure. It's a symptom of systemic rot. It's what happens when ideology replaces ethics, when the ends justify any means, when the pursuit of political victory blinds those in power to the long-term damage they inflict. The law, once bent, doesn't easily straighten again. The credibility of the justice system, so carefully constructed over centuries, can be shattered in a single politically motivated prosecution. That is the real cost of weaponized justice. It's not just one career, one case, or one man on trial. It's the rule of law itself standing in the dock, pleading for its survival. Public trust, once the invisible thread holding democracy together, is beginning to unravel before our very eyes. You can sense it in the tone of conversations, in the skepticism of headlines, in the quiet disillusionment that has crept into ordinary households. Americans are no longer asking whether justice is being served. They're asking who justice is serving. And that question, simple yet devastating, cuts to the very core of the nation's identity. The courtroom that was meant to symbolize fairness has become a stage for politics, and the audience, the American people, are losing faith in the performance. Every overreach, every inconsistency, every exposed agenda deepens that wound, and the consequences of that erosion are far more dangerous than any single trial. When the public sees a prosecutor rebuked by a judge for overstepping her authority, it doesn't just look like a personal failure. It looks like a betrayal of trust. The people were told this was about justice, about accountability, about the sanctity of law. But what they are witnessing feels more like a chess game played by elites who view the law as a tool, not a principle. And once people see that the scales of justice can be tilted by those in power, the entire structure loses its legitimacy. The courtroom becomes another political arena, the judge another referee in a contest of ideology, and the citizens watching from the sidelines begin to wonder whether truth even matters anymore. This isn't cynicism. It's realism. Decades of institutional manipulation have taught Americans to be suspicious. They have watched laws rewritten, narratives spun, and rules selectively enforced. But this case, with its dramatic reversals and courtroom clashes, crystallizes that suspicion into certainty. It confirms what many have quietly believed for years, that justice in America depends not on evidence, but on allegiance. The prosecutor's fall from grace was not merely her own undoing, it was a symbol of a justice system that has become unrecognizable to those it claims to serve. And once that perception takes hold, no verdict, no matter how lawful, can restore confidence. The hook here is stark and unmissable. When trust in the justice system collapses, everything else begins to crumble with it. The law is the foundation upon which all other institutions rest. The government, the media, the markets, even the concept of democracy itself. Without faith in fairness, authority turns to suspicion, order gives way to resentment, and civic unity dissolves into chaos. That's what makes this trial more than a political scandal. It's a cultural turning point. People are not just losing trust in a single prosecutor or case. They're losing trust in the very notion that the system is still capable of impartiality. And make no mistake, This disillusionment doesn't fade quietly. It festers, it spreads across party lines, across social classes, across generations. When people believe the system is rigged, they stop participating in it. They stop voting. They stop engaging. They retreat into cynicism or tribalism, convinced that truth and justice are illusions maintained by those in power. That's the real danger. Not that one politician might escape prosecution, but that millions of citizens might stop believing in the system altogether. The prosecutor's overreach, the judge's rebuke, the media's selective outrage, all of it feeds into a collective awakening, a realization that the balance between justice and politics has tipped too far to one side. You can feel the exhaustion in the air, an exhaustion not of politics, but of belief. The American public has endured scandal after scandal, promise after promise, reform after reform, yet somehow the same patterns repeat. The same faces, the same double standards, the same immunity for the powerful. And now, as this case unravels, the public isn't angry in the way they once were, they're numb. That numbness is more dangerous than rage. Rage can inspire reform, but numbness breeds apathy, and apathy is how democracies die quietly. The irony is painful. In their quest to prove the system's strength by holding Trump accountable, those in power may have revealed its greatest weakness, its loss of moral authority. The prosecutor's humiliation, the judge's frustration, and the public's growing skepticism have merged into a single, damning question: who can we trust? The establishment's answer, "Trust us," no longer carries weight. Once that bond between citizen and institution is broken, it cannot be mended by spin or sound bites. It requires something far deeper: honesty, humility, and accountability, virtues that have become rare in modern governance. And that's where we are, standing at the crossroads of perception and truth, watching the system wrestle with its own credibility. The judge's sharp rebuke didn't just expose misconduct, it ignited a spark in the public consciousness. People are beginning to see what was always there, but rarely acknowledged: that the justice system, once revered as the backbone of democracy, is now entangled in the same web of politics it was meant to restrain. The prosecutor's fall is not the end of a case, it's the beginning of an awakening. And that awakening, once it spreads, may become the most powerful verdict of all, delivered not by a court, but by the people themselves. In closing, let me leave you with this: what we are seeing isn't just the collapse of one prosecution. It's the exposure of a deeper truth. When power turns inward, when those tasked with upholding justice begin to fear exposure themselves, the tide begins to turn. Whether you support Trump or not, this moment should make you pause. Because if the law can be bent this easily for political convenience, no one, not even the most ordinary citizen, is truly safe from its misuse. So yes, the prosecutor has been thrown under the bus. But what's really being crushed beneath those wheels is the illusion of impartial justice. The judge didn't just smoke her out, he smoked out the hypocrisy of an entire establishment. And that, my friends, is a reckoning far greater than any single trial.